What is going on, guys? It's been quite some time since the last video, but today while mapping for solitary echoes I finally came up with another topic for a video. Namely, I want to talk a little about all the little tricks in texturing levels on GoldSrc that I use every day. In this video I'm gonna use vanilla Half-Life textures only, since that's what most of you are familiar with, I guess. Of course, these tricks also apply for any textures you use. I mentioned this before, but I don't want to give the impression that the methods I am using are the correct way to do anything. It's just what I am using, and I thought maybe it's interesting for some of you. If you know a better way or want to add something to the stuff I'm saying, please do so in the comments. The cool thing about GoldSrc mapping is that there's so many cool ideas and hidden little things. People come up with all sorts of clever ways to push the boundaries of the engine, and no matter how long you're mapping, there's always new stuff to learn. But before we start, I just wanted to say that I've tried to give this video a little more structure, so that's less of a mess and random rambling and a little more focus on the actual topic. My idea behind this is, since it's kind of like a tutorial, it should be clearly understandable. If you like or don't like this, please let me know so I can adjust. Your feedback really helps me make these videos better. Alright? Alright, let's finally dive into today's video. Alright, so something I noticed really early on is that a lot of textures for older games tend to emulate three-dimensional structures. Back in the day, of course, this was done to save on unnecessary world polygons, which would negatively affect the performance. But luckily today our machine's a little more powerful than back in '98, so we can safely add a little more detail to our maps. Especially now that Valve has raised a lot of engine limitations with GoldSrc with the 25th anniversary update, or if you're mapping for an engine fork like Svengen or Sash3D. So let's look at an example of what I mean. So a lot of maps I see posted every day look something like this right here, which is, perfectly fine, there's nothing wrong with it, but like all things in life there's always room for improvement. In this case we could give this thing right here a little more structure. So the way we do this would be to create an additional brush and apply the same texture to the front of the face, and then it looks like this. Of course, in this case we also have these new faces right here. You could either apply a generic texture to this that vaguely fits the color scheme, or you could go the extra mile and use the texture you already used for the wall and make it fit on here. It really depends on how good the player can look at this structure. If it's hidden away somewhere out of the player's reach, you could probably get away with a generic concrete texture. If the player is supposed to have a good look on this wall, this method looks a lot better. Like I just basically used the same edge from this texture but mirrored in here. This is a little faster and saves a single face, but depending on which texture you use, it doesn't always make a whole lot of sense. It may look alright for a bundle of cables or something, but when you're creating something like, let's say, an H-beam or something, it doesn't really make sense for it to be triangular. One thing that I always do and make in hallways like this is moving the walls outwards 8 units or however wide these trims are. This helps make the space feel less cramped, and also the trims don't interfere with the floor texture. For example, if I move this back like this, that doesn't fit anymore down here. Of course, the three-dimensional structures don't necessarily have to protrude into the player's space, they can also be directed away from it. For example, here I created this little niche by constructing this wall out of 4 individual brushes, like so. With textures like this, it looks especially nice if you pay a little attention to these faces right here. These ones. I also added these floor brushes with a wall texture as well, but these are probably a little overkill. And also you don't have to use this technique for horizontal details only. For example, this texture has these cool columns right here that you can make three-dimensional. Like so. It's made out of individual brushes. In this version of this corridor I also raised the ceiling 16 units and used the bottom of the wall texture as a top trim as well. In my opinion, it's always good to not get stuck in the 128 by 128 grid, but to have a look at what the textures offers and then go from there. With horizontal stuff like this, you have to be careful not to create structures where the player can get caught in. This is especially important for combat areas or multiplayer maps with the frantic gameplay. When in doubt, you can create little clip brushes like these to guide the player past the column. Alright, so as you probably know, many floor, wall and ceiling textures are designed to fit on brushes that are like 128 by 128 units or something similar, 64 by 64, you know. This makes it very easy to fit a texture to, let's say, a brush 64 by 128 units. But if you are working with brushes that are outside of the scale, texturing can become very tricky. For example, right here I have a hallway where I just went full retard and put in all the trims. Now I have this ceiling brush which is 224 by 96 units. Let's say I want to use this texture here and I want the structure to be on this brush 4 times. So of course I can try to manually scale it the correct way and shift it the correct way and whatever, but there's a simpler solution. First of all, when we want to have it 4 times, we have to scale down the brush to a quarter of its original size. So I can use this X, this marks half of the brush, so that's the half, and of course when I want to have a quarter I do it again, and then I just can select the face with the texture on and choose fit. And now I just have to restore the brush to its original size, and the structure is on it 4 times, just like I wanted. This is also great for doing something like, for example, an air duct. Like here I have a duct that is like 40 by 96 units and 16 units high. So what I did is just to reduce the duct to a quarter of its size, fit the textures on all sides, and then put the brush back to its original size, and there it is. Another way to achieve the same thing is by using a temporary brush for texture application. So for example, I have another odd size brush right here. It's in this case 56 by 88 units, so fairly weird dimension, and I have this texture, and let's say I want only one of these metal plates on this face of the brush. Now instead of doubling the size, I can also just copying the brush and then apply the texture to both faces, treat as one of course, and make it fit like this. And now when I delete my temporary brush, I have exactly what I wanted. One of the metal plates is on this face of the brush. It really depends. You can double it and you can copy it. Depends on the situation and your personal taste. Another thing I often see in custom maps is outdoor floors where the texture repeats very often. This makes the tiling of the texture very obvious, like here, especially when looked at from some distance. To combat this, you could scale the texture up if the floor exceeds a certain size. So like example, we do scale 2, and right now the tiling isn't as obvious as before. Try to find a scale that is a good compromise between not repeating too often and not getting too blurry. Be careful though when you are using different textures in conjunction to each other. For example, right here I have this floor with a 1.0 scale and the sand dunes or whatever with a 2.0 scale. Now when I zoom in where the two brushes cross to each other, I can see a sharp difference between the sharpness of this texture and the blurriness of this texture. So in this case it would be better to make both of them 2.0 so they are somewhat even like this. And now I can see I still have like a little seam here, but they are on the same blurriness level. So yeah, it looks better this way. Of course, the drawback of this method is that scaling textures up makes them more blurry. Unfortunately, I don't really have a good solution for this. I mean, you can always try to clutter a huge outdoor area with rocks, trees, maybe some small buildings or whatever, so you can get away with a 1.0 texture scale without the tiling standing out as much, but that's just a workaround. Another fix could be AI upscaling the texture to 256 by 256 and then adding it as a custom texture. But of course that would mean no longer working with vanilla assets only. Though you can always include your custom textures so the map will still run in vanilla Half-Life. Some AI upscalers also alter the texture's borders, so there could be some seams where the texture is tiling, so that's something to keep in mind. An additional trick for outdoor areas is to rotate floor texture slightly. You see many of Half-Life's outdoor textures have these subtle kind of horizontal lines, like right here. It almost looks like these sand patches are sitting on a grid. I guess it's because of the way textures were drawn back in the day or something, or maybe 1998's method of making textures tileable wasn't very suited for organic materials. However, the side effect of this is that structures which are sitting on the grid and have lots of 90-degree corners often have this unnatural look in combination with the floor they're standing on. The building and the floor have this kind of parallel look to them, almost as if they were constructed on an invisible grid, which you know they actually were, but of course the player doesn't need to know this. So a little trick I often use is to rotate the floor texture ever so slightly. I'd say about 20 or 30 degrees is already enough. In game it doesn't really matter which direction the texture is oriented to because it's an organic structure, but it really helps breaking up this on-grid parallel feeling of the map. So right here let's use maybe like 20-degree rotation, and I can see already the parallel feeling of the floor and the building is broken up. Of course what helps even more is to include lots of maybe like 45-degree angles or even round corners if you can spare the polygons. As you may know, I already did a whole video about how to make cool pipes, so this is just a very brief recap. So when the texture has these like baked in shadows, like here, it can be somewhat tedious aligning it to all the faces of a cylinder, but there's a nice trick for that. Basically, when you create a cylinder, like here, before you start texturing it, you just flatten it as much as possible, like so. Now we have half of its faces on more or less a flat plane. You can now apply the texture to all faces of one side, and then select all faces, check world alignment, of course treat as one, and make it fit. Same thing on the other side. Apply to all faces. Sorry about that. Check world alignment and make it fit. And then you can just restore the original shape, and there you have it. The drawback of this method is that the texture becomes a little blurry and distorted on the side. That's because it gets stretched when you restore the shape. So it really depends on how much the cylinder is in or out of sight of the player and how well it's lit. By the way, if you want to add some cool 45-degree corners to your pipe, you should check out my video explaining this. I will link it in the description. Alright, let's see how we can make those cool glow-in-the-dark LED lights. Again, we technically stray from directly using vanilla Half-Life assets, but like mentioned before, you can put your custom textures in an extra WOD file and just WOD include it to your map. Maybe you are even working on a own mod or a standalone game, so it isn't really a concern. So the first step would be to extract the texture you want to use from halflife.wod using Wally or HL texture tools, whatever you prefer. In my case, I chose computer terminal with some bright LEDs, and now you just load the texture into your graphics editor of your choice. This is a really simple step, so in doubt you could even use MS Paint. Next step is to just color everything that's not an LED or everything that you don't want to glow black, like so. This part right here, this part, and then it gets a little tedious. You know, of course, it would be faster to just open it in GIMP or Photoshop and cut out everything that you don't want to use. But you know, it's like this, so you can see what the idea behind it is. When you're done, you just put the texture back into your game, maybe like in an extra WOD like I mentioned before, and then we can go back to Jack. Now, also when I save my new created additive texture, I always use like right here the original texture name and just add _add to it, because this way the additive texture is always right next to the original texture where it belongs. Back in the editor you can just create your computer like you normally would, like this, or whatever you prefer. And the secret now is that you add a brush in front of it that's just a single unit wide. You can see it here, single unit, and I made a Funk Illusionary and with a render mode additive and FX amount 255. You then apply the custom texture to the brush so that it fits exactly like the texture below, and that's pretty much it. Problem now is that since the illusionary brush is 1 unit thick, there's a visible gap between the computer and the additive layer in front of it. Like right here, there's this gap, and if you move closely to this in-game, you can see this gap. And there's two ways to fix this. One way to fix this is you can use the move tool and move the brush by a very small percentage, let's say 1.9, and this will move the brush very close to the structure below it. And in this case it doesn't really work because I already created some wedges, but if those were usual brushes it would work. But I don't like this method because right now it's not on grid anymore, and I'm old school. I need to be everything on grid or else I can't sleep at night. And also this can lead to problems when you try to copy and paste this and use it somewhere else. The whole structure can become off grid, and yeah, I don't really like it, so let's put it back. The other method is you can create these triangular wedges like right here, and this way you have come here. You have the gap is a little smaller, and it's still everything is on grid, so it's like a compromise. And also what you can additionally do is you can select individual parts of your additive face, and you can stretch it like that, and then this is even a thinner gap, but it's still on grid, and you can, if you have a floor below it, you can stretch it even more. Everything is on grid, everything is fine, but I always do it like this, and it's okay for me. I think additive lights created with this method look really cool, especially in dimly lit areas where the lights can glow ominously in the dark. When the lights cover a large area, like for example these computer screens right here, you could even place a very weak point light in front of it. Just get the exact RGB color from the texture using Wally or whatever, and set this as the color of your point light. Now give the point light a brightness of 30 or maybe 40 at max, and bam, you have a really moody glow in the dark thing right there. I use this in Solitary Echoes all the time because this mod is very dark by default, and this method creates these small interesting pockets of light where the player can look at, and it's also great for guiding the player towards items or luring him into a trap or whatever. Okay, maybe you have seen a curved road, a corridor or whatever like this, where every texture is perfectly aligned with the curve, and you wondered, how did they do this? I mean, sure, you could select every single face and individually adjust the scaling and the shift and the rotation manually for all the faces, but you would probably go insane during the process. So before you do that, you better use this simple secret little trick to make your life easier. Okay, I was kidding, there is no secret trick. You just use Totex Map to Curve. This tool is insane, I repeat, it is insane. You basically just map a straight corridor, road or whatever you want, and the software just generates a curve with perfectly aligned textures for you. The new version even has a GUI now, which makes it even easier to use, since it was a command line tool before. I will link in the description, you should absolutely check it out. I said it before, it is absolutely insane, and it is essential that you use this tool right fucking now.